Good evening, guys, or morning, depending on when you watch the video. I'm going to talk about how not to wire a pole barn. This barn was built in the 40s. It was a forestry service building at one point, and the original owner of the property purchased it in the late 60s, and he took it apart and built it on the property that I'm at right now, which used to be 21 acres, but now it's 14. That's some serious engineering / feat on doing that by yourself. I'm sure he had some help, but according to the neighbors around here, he pretty much built this himself. So that guy was quite a dude. I don't think I could have done something like this. Damn. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us. He passed away in the early 2000s, but he is buried in the graveyard, which is about half a mile from my house. Now, I'm not hitting on the guy, but I imagine back then they didn't have code, like they do now as far as wiring goes. And what he did is clearly worked for 60 years, but this is not how to wire a barn. Now, of course, I'm kind of hitting on myself because I do the same thing, but you should always have your Romex cables in some kind of sheathing. In a house, no, but in a barn like this, you get squirrels and chipmunks and stuff like that, and this wire up here, actually, I need to put in a box because the original Romex, you can see it's darker than the wider stuff. The original Romex up there was actually chewed. I do have a barn chipmunk in here, and I name him Chippy. He's still active in the wintertime. He runs around in the walls right there, but it's actually right where the circuit panel is. I can actually hear him right now, and I don't really like that because I imagine he, on top of chewing the walls, which I do hear, he probably is chewing the cable back there, which is not a good thing. So these chipmunks and squirrels and stuff, they run around up on these ledges up here, and they can actually chew the wire. That wire was chewed. Part of the reason why it's spliced right there is because I cut the chewed stuff off, but I also drilled those two holes right there, and the reason why is because of the 50-watt wall pack that I put in front of the door, right above it. The first hole I drilled a little bit too far to the right. But anyway, so I need to put a box right there to cover those wire nuts. But yeah, the wire actually here actually has like another chew in it, but it's not bad. It just needs to be wrapped in electrical tape, and that is actually code. You can wrap it in electrical tape, and to be honest, it's actually better to wrap in tape or use liquid electrical tape than it is to actually cut the wire, because when you cut the wire, you're creating more spots where you have to use wire nuts, and that's actually a failure point. But anyway, they should have all been in some kind of metal sheathing. Two is right by the door where the water is. I don't think I would have used this regular box right here. I would have used a waterproof box because when it rains and stuff, like for example, these windows are the original ones, but I did put plexiglass, so these original framing. But imagine when it rained in here and it just got this all wet. That's another fire hazard. So these should actually be waterproof boxes. And two or three, the big thing is for the circuit box, most everything I've replaced. I haven't replaced the bigger breakers yet. But some of the smaller, yes, my writing sucks. I need to find a better pen. But the smaller breakers I've replaced, all 15 amp breakers. The larger ones I haven't yet, like the 40, 60, 20 amps. And that's the problem, is the wiring in here. This is all 14 gauge cable. So all this wiring, I put these ceiling fans up because it does get a little warm in here in the summer. But the boxes were there, the little the light boxes were already there. And of course he had 8 T12 lights in here, or 4 shop fixtures. I just repaired 2 of them and put 2 LED shop lights in here. So those are all powered onto the same breaker, the ceiling fans, the lights. And stupidly, what the guy did was he put a box down here. This 14 gauge cable is actually running through the wall over here, and it actually connects to this joint right here. So all of these lights are wired down to here, and this one that goes outside is buried under the ground, and it goes to my light pole outside with the 2 mercury vapor lights. So on top of all of these interior lights and the ceiling fans, the pole is also wired up to these lights. And on top of that, the horse walkout or walk-in that I have over here, you can't see it because they're off. I actually wired from the mercury vapor light over here across down here and to that. So I have 2 high pressure sodium lights, I have 2 mercury vapor lights, I have 4 shop lights, I have 2 ceiling fans, and also the ceiling fan 4 little bulbs right there. They're all wired on one breaker. What he should have done, and what I'm going to do, is I'm actually going to, this wire right here that's hooked up to the lights, I'm actually just going to disconnect from the one that goes to the outside lights, and I'm just going to, block it with wire nuts. And I'm actually going to run another 14 gauge Romex cable over here and to the circuit panel. I don't know how to go through the walls, and I don't know what obstacles are in these walls because there was termite damage in certain places, so I'm just going to have to run it along the drywall on the outside. But that way, the exterior pole lights and the high pressure sodium lights are all on a dedicated circuit, and the interior lights are on their own dedicated circuit. So because it's annoying, if I need to work on the pole outside, when I flip the breaker, it turns off all these lights and I trip on myself. I actually showed you guys a video of me working on a 400 watt high pressure sodium light, and I was tripping all over myself because I had to turn off the exterior lights. Now another problem that he did, and I don't recommend this to anybody, is in here there's 3 receptacles. He wired a 20 amp breaker from a 12 gauge wire, which is what you're supposed to do, 12 gauge and 20 amps. He wired that all the way right here, that's the 12 gauge wire, that white wire right here, to the first receptacle. Now to the second receptacle, and then the third receptacle is 14 gauge cable. So he split the 12 gauge into a thinner wire, which is 14 gauge, but he put a 20 amp breaker on there. That's not a good idea, and the reason why is because if you put 2,000 watts, which a 20 amp breaker can support, on these outlets, then the breaker won't pop, and what's going to happen is the 14 gauge cable is going to get warmer and warmer, and it could start a fire. Now, I don't think it will, because 14 gauge can actually handle more than what it's rated for, and to be honest, the distance is not that far between these. The longer distance you have, the more resistance there is in the wire. However, what I did was I put a 15 amp breaker in there instead of a 20 amp because I just don't feel safe with a 20 amp breaker on 14 gauge cable. And he did the same thing for this. This light switch and the 12 gauge cable that goes to it, it splits off again into 14 gauge cable, which runs into these lights, which are just regular light bulb sockets. Now the problem is these are only 10 watts, so it's not like I'm going to put 2,000 watts in these lights. So that's okay, you know what I mean? But if there's ever a short or something like that, and it draws the amperage or wattage or whatever, it could start a fire, and the breaker will never pop. So again, I changed the 20 amp breaker to 15 amps, and the worst offending one of all is the stall area. There's one receptacle in there, one power line going to that, and that receptacle was run off of a 20 amp breaker, and again, the 20 amp breaker actually goes on a 12 gauge cable here, and it actually splits off into 14 gauge again to that receptacle. Now my mom has her horses in here, and she decided to put 2 heaters in there. One of them was 1,000 watts, the other one was 1,000 watts. That's 2,000 watts a heater, and what that did was it actually popped the breaker, and while they were running for however long they were running, it actually melted the wire going to the receptacle. And the reason why was because the receptacle was 14 gauge cable and it can't handle that amount of wattage. So don't wire 14 gauge cable off of 12 gauge cable and use a 20 amp breaker. You can split into thinner wire, which is fine. Just make sure you use the correct breaker for that thinner wire. So yeah, don't wire your pole barn like this if you ever do get a barn or something like that. Check the wiring, make sure everything is done correctly so you don't start a fire. Now, you know, did it work for 60 years? Sure. Is it going to work for another 60 years? Maybe. You know, who knows? But, you know, it's just, I don't feel safe with something like that. You know what I mean? And another issue is, again, he did like half of his wiring in metal sheathing, and the other half he didn't. And again, right next to the door, a receptacle or light switch outlet that's not waterproof. I don't know if they had waterproof ones back in the 70s. Maybe not. Maybe that's the reason why he just used the basic ones. But these basic ones are still sold in Lowe's. Here's another one right next to the door, not waterproof. Anyway, and of course there's no metal sheathing on this. So that's the only thing I'm guilty of, is a lot of the wiring I did in the stall area I didn't put sheathing on. It is expensive, so I think that's probably the reason why he did that too. Like, for example, tonight I'm going to be, almost tripped. This is actually for the 200 watt mercury vapor fixtures. This is a 12 gauge cable. This is a 14 gauge cable. Again, it's fine if you do that because they are going into a 15 amp breaker. But again, don't put a 20 amp breaker for 14 gauge cable. So I'm actually going to wire some of the regular white Romex up here all the way through to the workshop area. And I'm actually going to split it into the receptacles in there into a light switch. And that's perfectly fine. You can run power off of the receptacle into a light switch in its own box. There's nothing wrong with that. So the only problem is if I turn off those receptacles through the breaker, I'm going to be turning off the lights as well. So, but that's what I'm going to do. And the reason why I'm not going to run it into the breaker is because the breaker only has enough room for 3 more the circuit box only has enough room for 3 more breakers, and I had plans for those 3 spots. So yeah, and I did check the receptacles in the workshop, and those thankfully are running off of 12 gauge cable, so I'm going to leave the 20 amp breaker for that. But these receptacles have to be switched to 15 amps, which is what I did. So do not wire your barn like that, and don't do what I'm doing by wiring Romex without metal sheathing, because Chippy in my wall over there is probably going to chew through this stuff. He probably already has behind there. I actually need to take some of the drywall off and look at the wiring back there. Now, the original owner did do metal sheathing in the wires behind the wall for the receptacles. I've already checked that. But for the lighting wire, he didn't. And this wire that runs along up here, you can actually go up in the ladder up there and check the wiring up there. None of it is in metal sheathing, and I did find a wire that was chewed pretty badly. I've already replaced that one. But, you know, to be honest, I should probably redo all of this stuff and put metal sheathing in all of it, but it's just the costs involved in it is just so much. But, you know, is the cost involved in that worth saving the barn? Yes. But, you know, I'm not rich, so it seems like I am, but I'm really not. So, anyway, yeah, I hope you guys liked this video. This is definitely different than actual lights. This is a little wiring video. Sure, a electrical inspector and stuff would have a heyday with this barn. But I've done the best I can for what resources I have. At least I switched the 20 amp breakers to 15 for everything that needs to be on 15. And I've inspected all of the wiring, and everything is in good shape, minus the few chew marks that I had on a few other wires. But again, I need to take some of the drywall down in certain spots, cut little holes in them, and inspect the wiring behind there. So get any more chews from the chipmunk and start fires from that. Just what I need is barbecue chipmunk to set a fire behind my walls. So anyway, hope you guys liked this video. Don't be a dumbass like the original owner did. You know, this can last 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and then one day